So welcome back to our second session on Ralph Waldo Emerson and his role as the Sage of Concord. Last week, I forgot to mention that these are the books that we are going through. We're going through Barry Andrews' American Sage, and then Barry Andrews also did kind of a compilation, a meditation on Emerson's writings throughout the year. It's called A Dream Too Wild, and it's fantastic. So right now, we're talking about chapter 1 of this book. And then every day, we're going to be reading an excerpt from Emerson here. Sound good? So in this session, session 2, we'll be diving into Emerson's philosophy of self-reliance and how it connects to ancient philosophical traditions, particularly Stoicism. Stoicism is very important for understanding Emerson, as well as exploring the impact of Unitarianism. So Emerson's early Unitarian upbringing, his early influence from Unitarian theology, as well as the very famous Unitarian minister named William Ellery Channing. Channing was a very important influence on Emerson, very much a mentor to Emerson, as Emerson was developing toward becoming a minister in the Unitarian Church. We'll also see how Emerson's thoughts on self-culture, cultivating the inner self, the inner landscape, became not just a personal philosophy for him, but a movement that influenced so many people in 19th century America, especially within Unitarianism. So this idea of a sage is interesting, and we need to start there because Emerson was known as the Sage of Concord even when he was alive. And I'm pretty sure this made him a little bit uncomfortable. So in ancient philosophy, the sage is an ideal figure, someone who embodies wisdom and virtue. And this figure is not just concerned with following rules, with being moral, but with living in a way that reflects inner integrity and freedom. So Emerson's philosophy of self-reliance aligns with this ancient concept of the sage. And remember, it's very inner. It's cultivating the inner ways of being, inner thought life, the inner landscape. You'll hear me say that phrase a lot because I'm in love with the late Irish poet and philosopher John O'Donohue. Talks a lot about the inner landscape. But that is really what Emerson can help us develop, ways of cultivating the inner world, our inner landscape. And this is very much a universal sage practice, a universal thing that people who are considered sages are going to do and going to want to challenge people to follow them in. So he also believed that cultivating inner freedom from external pressures and concerns, was essential for personal growth and wisdom. His focus was on developing one's character, much like the Stoic and Epicurean sages of old. But just because Emerson was so focused inward did not mean that he was not focused outward. Emerson lived his life in community, with other people, for causes and movements that he believed in. And he was able to do this really well because he also decided to cultivate his inner world before moving on to the outer world. Let's talk a little bit about Stoicism. Emerson drew heavily from Stoicism, and Stoicism is a school of thought that taught that the importance of cultivating virtue while detaching from the things that we cannot control was a very important practice. So inner virtue, detachment from things we can't control. Okay? The Stoics believe that much of our suffering comes from our attachments to people, to possessions, to outcomes. Emerson admired this very much. He admired this idea and saw it as central to his core philosophy of self-reliance. For him, true freedom wasn't about independence from society, but about cultivating inner strength to remain calm, centered, and virtuous no matter what life threw at you. So that's a really important thing to remember, I think. Emerson taught that through self-culture, cultivating the inner landscape, the soul, as Emerson called it, continuously improving ourselves, we can align more closely with this ideal of inner wisdom. And this idea of inner wisdom for Emerson, again, was not just for wisdom's sake. Not just for inner wisdom for only Emerson to enjoy, only Emerson to think about the world through. This inner wisdom was meant to be lived out in community, in the world, together, in the thought communities, in utopian communities that Emerson was connected to. He was very concerned about living a flourishing life, not just in his mind and in his heart, but in the world as well. So the next important thing this chapter is going to talk about is Emerson's focus on where this idea of self-culture came from, because it didn't just pop out of nowhere. It was deeply influenced by the Unitarian upbringing and his mentorship from William Ellery Channing, who I mentioned just a second ago. And Channing was one of the most prominent Unitarian ministers of the 19th century. So this is a really important part of Emerson's journey. Channing emphasized the idea that human beings have immense potential for moral and spiritual development. He taught that self-culture, the practice of self-examination, introspection, and personal discipline, was both a practical and spiritual pursuit. So notice practical and spiritual. You can't have one without the other in Channing's thought. For Channing, this wasn't about making yourself a better person for the sake of society. It was about aligning yourself with higher moral principles. And this is the kind of thinking that Channing was pushing toward Emerson, and Emerson was soaking this up like a sponge. So while Emerson absorbed these values from Channing and Unitarianism, he eventually grew more critical of traditional religious authority. And this is important for Unitarian Universalists because we are also critical of traditional religious authority. Emerson was especially influenced by his education at Harvard, of course, where Enlightenment thinkers like John Locke dominated the philosophical curriculum. So John Locke, Immanuel Kant, G.W. Hegel. Emerson was reading all of these extremely deep thinkers, and because these thinkers dominated the philosophical curriculum. John Locke's empiricism especially taught that all knowledge comes through the senses, so the five senses, right? All knowledge starts there and is limited to there, and that religion needed to be grounded in reason. But Emerson felt this approach didn't leave enough room for spiritual experience, for mystery, for the transcendent awe that happens, sometimes seeming like we didn't need our sensory organs to have that kind of experience. So because Emerson was so interested in intuition and spiritual experience and what those two things meant for the self-cultivation of the soul and the way we know things in the world, he eventually rejected the idea that religious truths needed to be revealed from an external source, like the Bible, and instead grounded moral law in human consciousness and nature itself. This is a massive, important move that Emerson is making here. So again, he rejected the idea that religious truths needed to be revealed from external sources, like the Bible or any other religious text or tradition, and instead grounded the moral law within human consciousness, within nature itself. And this move marked a shift in his philosophy toward a more individualized spirituality. And I know when we hear those words, individualized spirituality, we can sometimes think, well, that sounds kind of selfish. But remember, Emerson is a man who takes his inner world very seriously, but also takes the wider society very seriously. He is always mixed up in what's going on in Concord, what was going on in Boston, what's going on in the world, what's going on with the people that are closest to him. He's a man deeply in tune with his own spiritual life, but also deeply in tune with society and society's goal of human flourishing. So we talked about Stoicism. Now another important strain in Emerson's thinking is going to be ancient virtue ethics. So, as Emerson moved away from traditional Unitarian thinking, his philosophy began to align more closely with ancient virtue ethics. And both Harvard's moral philosophy, Harvard again, where Emerson studied, and the teachings of philosophers like Aristotle and the Stoics focus on developing character rather than simply following rules, which we've talked about a little bit about this already. They shared a common goal, what the Greeks called eudaimonia, right? So eudaimonia, or human flourishing. Eudaimonia, human flourishing. For Emerson, self-culture became the means by which individuals could reach this state of flourishing. Self-culture, cultivating the inner landscape, taking time to do that kind of inner work, helps us reach a state of eudaimonia, of flourishing in the world, in society. Rather than seeing morality as a static set of rules, Emerson saw it as a dynamic force. And I love this image, I love this picture. This is what one of the things that Emerson can do, can help us think about things like morality or the moral law as a dynamic force and not just this thing that's hanging on the wall that we have to check in with. No, it's a dynamic force that affects us every day, that we engage with every day, right? So Emerson saw it as a dynamic force within us, constantly guiding us toward personal growth and the ideal state of being in the world. So as Emerson begins to publish his ideas, it's obvious that an emphasis on self-culture resonated deeply with 19th century American culture, particularly among Unitarians, right? So our lineage as Unitarian Universalists. This was a time when Americans were exploring new forms of personal growth and autonomy. Self-culture, cultivating the inner landscape, wasn't just about becoming better morally. Remember, we just talked about this. It was about improving yourself intellectually, spiritually, and emotionally. The balance of the intellectual part of ourselves, the spiritual part of ourselves, and the emotional part of ourselves. It became a central theme even in Unitarian thought, helping to shape how individuals saw their role in society. So Emerson's philosophy, like Channing's before him, like his mentor Channing before him, promoted self-examination, discipline, and continued self-improvement as ways to live a virtuous life. Not just checking off a box on a piece of paper that we hung on the wall like a to-do list, but a focus on living a virtuous life in the world. But for Emerson, it was also about finding your own path, grounded in your own unique talents, conscience, and connection to the natural world. Very important things there that we're going to talk more about as we move further through Barry Andrews' American Sage text. And thanks again for joining me in this journey through Emerson's philosophy. I hope this has inspired you a little bit this morning, and I will see you in just a moment.